Ruth Freeman clutched her swollen belly, tears staining her uniform from another 16-hour shift. The billionaire CEO who'd buried his heart with his wife felt something dangerous stirring while looking at his pregnant maid. One knock on her car window would change everything, but walking away meant letting her freeze to death. What choice could a man make when mercy felt like betrayal? But to understand how we got to this heart-wrenching moment, we need to go back 9 months earlier to when Lucky Blackwood stood at his mansion's window at 2 in the morning, staring into the darkness that had become his constant companion. The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Blackwood estate, each drop echoing through the cavernous rooms like tears Lucky Blackwood refused to shed. 2 years had passed since Sarah's funeral. Yet her absence still carved through him with surgical precision. He pressed his palm against the cold glass, watching water streak down in patterns that reminded him of the IV tubes that had kept his wife tethered to life those final desperate weeks. "Mr. Blackwood?" Mrs. Faith Mute's voice carried across the marble foyer, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. "The new cleaning girl will be starting her shift soon." Lucky didn't turn from the window. Another face he wouldn't bother learning, another person who would tiptoe around the shrine his home had become. The massive estate housed a full staff of 12, yet he felt more alone than if he'd been stranded on a desert island. At 35, he commanded a technology empire worth $2.8 billion, but couldn't buy back a single moment with the woman who'd made breathing feel natural. "She'll be working the night shift," Mrs. Faith continued, her voice carefully neutral. Mrs. Sarah's study included. Lucky's jaw tightened. Sarah's study remained exactly as she'd left it. Medical journals stacked beside poetry books, her reading glasses folded on top of a half-finished crossword puzzle. Most staff members avoided the room entirely, unable to bear the weight of preserved grief. "Fine," he murmured, his breath fogging the glass. "Just keep her quiet." 4 floors below. Ruth Freeman pulled her battered Honda into the service entrance, her hands trembling from exhaustion rather than cold. At 28, she carried herself with the careful dignity of someone who'd learned that survival required grace under pressure. Her rich brown skin held a luminosity that 16-hour workdays couldn't entirely dim, though purple shadows beneath her dark eyes betrayed the cost of her relentless schedule. She gathered her cleaning supplies from the trunk, each movement deliberate despite the bone-deep fatigue that had become her constant companion. 3 jobs kept her afloat, barely. The mansion cleaning gig from 4 to 8 in the morning, then the downtown office building until 2 in the afternoon, followed by evening shifts at the medical center. Sleep happened in fragments, stolen moments between obligations that never seemed to end. Ruth had once dreamed of wearing scrubs as a pediatric nurse, not the generic uniform that marked her as invisible help. Those dreams died the morning she'd found their joint bank account emptied and Mark Hammett's goodbye note explaining that nursing school was too expensive for someone like her. That someone like her had managed a full scholarship apparently hadn't mattered when he'd decided she wasn't worth the investment of his time. The mansion's service entrance opened with a soft click, revealing Mrs. Faith Mute's disapproving silhouette. The head housekeeper had perfected the art of looking down on people while maintaining professional courtesy, a skill that probably required years of practice. "Miss Freeman, I presume." Mrs. Faith's tone suggested she'd already found Ruth wanting. "You'll start on the main floor. Mr. Blackwood values his privacy, so discretion is essential." Ruth nodded, following the older woman through hallways that belonged in a museum rather than a home. Oil paintings in gilded frames watched their progress, and Ruth found herself wondering if anyone had ever run laughing through these corridors or left a coffee cup ring on the antique tables. The study, Mrs. Faith paused outside an ornate wooden door, requires special attention. Mr. Blackwood's late wife spent considerable time there. The reverence in her voice made Ruth's chest tighten. She understood loss, had felt it carve through her when her parents died in that car accident during her sophomore year, leaving her to navigate the world alone. But there was something about the careful way Mrs. Faith spoke of the dead woman that suggested a love story interrupted rather than completed. "I understand," Ruth said softly. "I'll be careful." Mrs. Faith studied her for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether Ruth possessed the emotional intelligence necessary to clean around grief. Apparently satisfied, she handed Ava the study key. Mr. Blackwood is often awake during your shift. He's not to be disturbed. Ruth began her work in the grand foyer, her movements efficient, despite the opulence that surrounded her. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic rainbows across marble floors that probably cost more than most people's homes. Yet underneath the luxury, she sensed a profound loneliness that made the beautiful spaces feel hollow. By 6 in the morning, she'd worked her way to the study. Ruth paused outside the door, key heavy in her palm. Something about this room felt sacred, like entering a church where someone still came to pray. The door opened to reveal a space frozen in time. Medical journals created neat stacks beside volumes of poetry, their spines bearing the wear patterns of frequent handling. A pair of delicate reading glasses sat folded atop a crossword puzzle, ink filling in perhaps half the spaces. Ruth could almost see the woman who'd lived here, intelligent, curious, someone who found beauty in both science and art. Photographs lined the mantelpiece and desk, a stunning blonde woman with kind eyes, always photographed beside a tall, dark-haired man whose smile looked genuine in ways Ruth suspected it no longer did. Their wedding photo showed two people who seemed to share some delicious secret, leaning into each other with the confidence of those who found their perfect match. Ruth began dusting with unusual reverence, treating each object like a prayer. She'd learned that loss required careful handling, that grief was a language spoken in preservation and ritual. When she reached the wedding photo, she traced the glass gently, wondering what it felt like to be loved with such obvious devotion. Most people avoid this room. Ruth spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Lucky Blackwood stood in the doorway, and she immediately understood why the cameras couldn't quite capture his presence. He was tall, easily 6'2", with the kind of broad shoulders that suggested he'd once been athletic before wealth and grief had refined him into something more dangerous. His dark hair showed threads of premature silver at the temples, and his gray eyes held depths that made Ruth think of winter storms. But it was the way he looked at her that made breathing difficult. Not with the casual dismissal she'd expected, but with a focused attention that made her feel suddenly, inexplicably visible. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood." Ruth set down her cleaning cloth, hands clasping behind her back. "I can come back later if you prefer." "You're not avoiding it." He stepped into the room, his presence immediately filling the space in ways that had nothing to do with his physical size. The room. Most of the staff find excuses not to clean in here. Ruth glanced back at the wedding photo, understanding flooding through her. She was beautiful. You both look so happy. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps that she'd acknowledged his wife, rather than pretending the evidence of love didn't exist everywhere around them. Sarah. The name came out rough, like he didn't say it often enough. She died 2 years ago. Cancer. I'm sorry for your loss. Ruth's voice carried a sincerity that made him study her more intently. Losing someone you love changes everything, doesn't it? Lucky moved closer, drawn by something in her tone that suggested personal understanding, rather than polite sympathy. You speak like you know. My parents. Car accident when I was 20. Ruth turned back to her dusting, unable to maintain eye contact while discussing loss. I used to think grief was something you got over. Now I know it's something you carry. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of shared understanding. Lucky found himself studying her profile, the elegant line of her neck, the careful way she handled Sarah's belongings, the intelligence in her dark eyes that seemed at odds with her circumstances. What's your name? He asked, though he already knew from Mrs. Faith's reports. Ruth Freeman. She glanced at him, surprised by the question. Most wealthy people didn't bother learning the names of their cleaning staff. Ruth. He tested the name, finding it suited her somehow. Strong, honest, unpretentious. You're different from the others. Heat climbed up Ruth's neck. I should get back to work. I have another job at 8. Another job? Lucky's brow furrowed. What time did you start here? 4 this morning. Ruth resumed dusting, hoping movement would dispel the strange electricity that seemed to pulse between them. I clean downtown offices until 2, then work at the medical center in the evenings. Lucky felt something twist in his chest that might have been outrage or protectiveness. When do you sleep? I manage. Ruth's tone suggested this wasn't a conversation she wanted to continue. I should really focus on. She reached for a book on a high shelf, standing on her toes to grasp it. The movement caused her to wobble slightly, and Lucky moved without conscious thought, his hands spanning her waist to steady her. The contact sent electricity shooting through both of them. Ruth's palm instinctively pressed against his chest for balance, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, they stood frozen in an embrace that felt both innocent and earth-shatteringly intimate. Ruth's breathing quickened, her hand registering the solid warmth of his chest beneath the expensive shirt, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with her own. Lucky's hands remained at her waist, thumbs accidentally brushing the bare skin where her uniform had ridden up slightly. The touch sent heat spiraling through her in ways that made her forget every rational thought about professional boundaries and the impossibility of their circumstances. Ruth started to speak, but the words died when she looked up into his eyes. The storm gray had darkened to something that made her stomach flutter with dangerous awareness. Lucky stared down at her, watching the motions play across her expressive face. When was the last time he'd felt anything this immediate, this consuming? When was the last time his body had responded to a woman with such primitive certainty? Not since Sarah, and that realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like awakening. Ruth. Her name emerged as something between a question and a plea. The sound of Mrs. Faith's approaching footsteps shattered the moment. Ruth stepped back quickly, Lucky's hands falling away as they both struggled to regain their composure. By the time the housekeeper appeared in the doorway, Ruth was focused intently on her dusting, though her hands shook slightly as she worked. Mr. Blackwood. Mrs. Faith's tone carried a note of surprise and disapproval. I didn't expect to find you here. I couldn't sleep. Lucky's voice had returned to its usual controlled timbre, but Ruth caught the slight roughness that suggested he'd been as affected as she was. Miss Freeman was just finishing up. Have you ever felt that spark of recognition with someone you couldn't have? Tell me your story in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe if this forbidden attraction is already pulling at your heartstrings. Mrs. Faith's sharp eyes missed nothing. The way Ruth's breathing remained slightly elevated, the careful distance they now maintained, the electricity that still seemed to pulse between them, despite their obvious attempts at professional composure. Of course, sir. Her tone suggested she'd be monitoring this situation very carefully. Miss Freeman, you should complete the upstairs hallways before your shift ends. Ruth nodded, gathering her supplies with movements that were just a fraction too quick to appear casual. As she moved toward the door, Lucky felt an almost physical pull to stop her, to continue their conversation, to understand why a woman cleaning his house at dawn had made him feel more alive than he had in 2 years. Miss Freeman. His voice stopped her at the threshold. Ruth turned back, her dark eyes cautious but curious. The guest house behind the pool, Lucky said, the words emerging before he'd fully considered them. It's empty. You're welcome to use it instead of driving home between shifts. It would be more efficient. The offer hung in the air like a bridge neither of them was sure they should cross. Ruth's lips parted in surprise. Mrs. Faith's expression grew thunderous, and Lucky felt his heart hammer with the audacity of what he'd just suggested. That's very generous, Mr. Blackwood, Ruth managed. But I couldn't. The commute alone must eat up an hour each way, Lucky continued, his business mind providing rational justification for an offer that felt anything but rational. You're working yourself to exhaustion. This is practical. Practical. Ruth almost laughed at the word, given the way her skin still tingled where he touched her. Nothing about this felt practical. Everything about it felt dangerous, thrilling, and absolutely impossible. But she was tired. Bone deep, soul-crushing tired. And the idea of not having to drive across town twice a day, of having even an extra hour to rest, was tempting enough to override every instinct, screaming that accepting this offer would change everything. "If you're certain it wouldn't be an imposition," she heard herself say. Lucky's smile was small but genuine, the first real smile Mrs. Faith had seen from him since Sarah's death, which was exactly why her expression suggested she was mentally drafting Ruth's termination papers. No imposition at all. Lucky's eyes held Ruth's for a moment longer than strictly professional. "Mrs. Faith can show you the way." As Ruth followed the disapproving housekeeper from the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just accepted more than temporary accommodation. She'd accepted an invitation into Lucky Blackwood's carefully controlled world, where grief and loneliness ruled with iron fists. What she didn't know was that upstairs, Lucky was staring out his window again, watching her figure disappear into the dawn light. For the first time in 2 years, he was looking forward rather than backward. For the first time since Sarah's death, he wanted to see what tomorrow might bring. And in the growing light of morning, neither of them realized they'd just taken the first step toward a love that would challenge everything they thought they knew about second chances, social boundaries, and the courage required to open a heart that had already been broken beyond repair. The guest house key felt heavy in Ruth's palm as she followed Mrs. Faith's rigid figure across the manicured grounds. Both women acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted in the space of a single touch. The guest house sat like a jewel among the landscaped gardens, its cottage-style architecture a stark contrast to the imposing mansion. Ruth stood at the threshold, key trembling in her hand as Mrs. Faith rattled off rules and regulations with military precision. No visitors, no loud music, no cooking strong-smelling foods, the housekeeper recited, her disapproval radiating like heat from asphalt. "Mr. Blackwood values his privacy above all else. You do well to remember that your proximity to his personal space is a privilege that can be revoked." Ruth nodded, though her attention kept drifting to the mansion's upper windows, where she could see a tall figure silhouetted against the dawn light. Even from this distance, she could feel Lucky's gaze on her, a sensation that made her pulse quicken in ways she absolutely couldn't afford. The guesthouse interior surprised her with its warmth. Where the mansion felt like a museum, this space radiated comfort, overstuffed chairs positioned near a stone fireplace, built-in bookshelves lined with well-worn novels, and windows that framed the gardens like living paintings. It was the kind of place Sarah Blackwood might have designed as a retreat from formal entertaining, a space where she could curl up with medical journals and crossword puzzles. "This is too much," Ruth whispered, running her fingers along the smooth granite countertops of the kitchenette. Mrs. Faith's expression suggested she agreed wholeheartedly. "Indeed, I trust you'll not take advantage of Mr. Blackwood's generosity." After the housekeeper departed, Ruth sank onto the plush sofa, surrounded by luxury she'd never experienced. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd grown up in a cramped apartment where her parents worked double shifts to afford rent. Yet here she sat in accommodations that probably cost more per month than her family had made in a year. She thought about Lucky's hands at her waist, the way his touch had sent electricity through her entire body. No man had ever affected her so immediately, so completely. Not even Mark, whose charm now seemed shallow compared to the depths she'd glimpsed in Lucky's storm-gray eyes. But Mark had taught her that men like Lucky didn't choose women like her. Not permanently, not when real life intruded on fantasy. Over the following weeks, Ruth settled into a routine that felt both natural and dangerously addictive. She'd arrive at 4 a.m. to find Lucky already awake, usually standing at his office window with a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. Their conversations began tentatively, professional exchanges about cleaning schedules and household maintenance, but gradually evolved into something deeper. Lucky found himself timing his insomnia to coincide with Ruth's arrival. He told himself it was coincidence, but the truth was that her presence had become the brightest part of his darkest hours. She moved through his home with a grace that transformed mundane tasks into something approaching art, and her careful reverence for Sarah's belongings touched him in ways he wasn't prepared to examine. "You're different," he said one morning. watching her dust the grand piano with the same attention she might give a Stradivarius. Most people see this house as a showcase. You see it as a home. Ruth paused in her dusting, considering his words. It was loved once. You can feel it in the details, the way the furniture is arranged, the books chosen for each room. Someone cared about making this beautiful. Sarah. Lucky's voice held that familiar roughness that appeared whenever he spoke his wife's name. She had very specific ideas about how things should look. I haven't changed anything since. That's not preservation, Ruth said gently, setting down her cloth to face him fully. That's a shrine, and shrines are for remembering the dead, not for the living to actually live in. The words hung between them like a challenge. Lucky felt a flash of something that might have been anger or relief. He couldn't be sure which. You think I should pack everything away, pretend 8 years of marriage never happened? I think Sarah loved you enough to want you to live again. Ruth's voice carried a conviction that surprised them both. From everything I see in her belongings, she was someone who embraced life fully. Do you really think she'd want you to stop living in her memory? Lucky stared at Ruth as if seeing her for the first time. Here was a woman who cleaned other people's houses for survival, yet possessed wisdom that his expensive therapists had failed to provide. The observation carved through his defenses with surgical precision, exposing truths he'd spent 2 years avoiding. You never met her, he said, but his tone lacked conviction. No, but I've been cleaning around her memory for weeks now. I know she collected first edition poetry books and left margin notes in medical journals. I know she kept a half-finished crossword puzzle because she was saving the last few words to complete with you. I know she loved you enough to trust that you'd carry on her legacy of caring about others, not just survive as a monument to what was lost. Lucky felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking, but opening, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. She was studying pediatric oncology when she got sick, he heard himself say. Wanted to help children the way her doctors helped her when she was young. She'd beat leukemia as a teenager. Thought she was invincible. Ruth moved closer without realizing it, drawn by the raw pain in his voice. She sounds like someone who understood how precious life is. She was. Lucky's eyes found Ruth's, and the connection between them pulsed with new intensity. She would have liked you. The simple statement carried more weight than poetry. Ruth felt tears prick her eyes, understanding that he'd just offered her the highest compliment possible. Sarah's hypothetical approval. I should finish the upstairs, Ruth managed, needing space to process the emotional tsunami threatening to overwhelm her. But as she turned to leave, Lucky's voice stopped her. Ruth. She looked back, and the way he said her name made her stomach flutter with dangerous awareness. Thank you for seeing her clearly, for seeing this place as more than just another job. Ruth nodded, not trusting her voice. As she climbed the marble staircase, she felt Lucky's gaze following her, and the sensation was both thrilling and terrifying. What was happening between them felt like stepping off a cliff, exhilarating and absolutely certain to end in disaster. A shift in their relationship became apparent to everyone in the household. Joseph Denny, Lucky's business partner and closest friend, noticed it first during their weekly breakfast meeting. You look different, Joseph observed, studying Lucky over his coffee cup. Less like you're attending your own funeral. Lucky paused in reviewing quarterly reports, surprised by the observation. I've been sleeping better. Sleeping, or just tired from being awake all night, talking to the help. The pointed question made Lucky's jaw tighten. Joseph was one of the few people who could speak to him with such directness, a privilege earned through 20 years of friendship and business partnership. Her name is Ruth Freeman, Lucky said carefully, and she's hardly the help in any dismissive sense. Ah. Joseph leaned back in his chair, recognition dawning. So that's why Mrs. Faith called my office yesterday asking about appropriate professional boundaries and whether I thought you needed grief counseling. Lucky's laugh held no humor. Mrs. Faith disapproves of everyone who isn't Sarah. And this Ruth Freeman, what does she think of your interest? Lucky considered the question, remembering the way Ruth's breathing had quickened when he'd steadied her on the ladder. The careful distance she maintained even as her eyes betrayed her awareness of him. She's cautious. Smart enough to know that anything between us would be complicated. Complicated. Joseph repeated the word thoughtfully. Lucky, you're worth nearly $3 billion. She cleans houses for a living. Complicated doesn't begin to cover it. Money isn't everything, Joseph. Spoken like someone who's never been without it. Joseph's tone remained gentle but firm. I'm not saying she's a gold digger. I'm saying the power imbalance makes any genuine relationship nearly impossible. How could she ever say no to you? How could you ever be sure her feelings are real? The questions lodged in Lucky's chest like barbs, because they echoed doubts he'd been trying to ignore. But then he remembered the way Ruth touched Sarah's belongings with reverence, the wisdom in her observations about grief and living, the genuine concern in her voice when she'd pointed out his exhaustion. She's not impressed by wealth, he said finally. If anything, it makes her more guarded, which could be the most sophisticated strategy of all. Lucky stood abruptly, anger flashing through him. You think I'm that naive? That lonely and desperate? I think you're a good man who's been through hell, and vulnerable people make vulnerable choices. Joseph's voice softened. I just don't want to see you hurt again. The conversation haunted Lucky for the rest of the day, Joseph's warnings echoing every time he found his thoughts drifting to Ruth. By the time 4 a.m. arrived, he was second-guessing every interaction they'd shared, analyzing her responses for signs of calculation or manipulation. Ruth sensed the change immediately. Lucky's usual warmth had been replaced by cool politeness, and his gray eyes held a wariness that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Had Mrs. Faith complained about their conversations? Had he reconsidered the wisdom of housing his cleaning staff on the property? Good morning, Mr. Blackwood, she said carefully, testing the waters. Miss Freeman. His tone was professionally distant. I trust the guest house remained satisfactory. The formal address stung more than Ruth expected. After weeks of growing intimacy, the return to surnames felt like a door slamming shut. Yes, sir, very comfortable. Ruth focused on arranging her cleaning supplies, hiding her confusion and hurt behind efficient movements. Lucky watched her careful composure and felt like a bastard. The woman who'd shown him such kindness deserved better than his paranoid suspicions. Yet Joseph's words kept replaying. How could he be sure her feelings were genuine when he held so much power over her livelihood? Ruth worked in silence, hyper-aware of the tension radiating from Lucky's rigid posture. Whatever had changed overnight, it felt like watching something beautiful wither before her eyes. She'd grown to treasure their early morning conversations, the way his face softened when he forgot to guard his expressions, the rare moments when his laughter emerged genuine and unfiltered. The morning proceeded with painful politeness until Ruth began cleaning the main staircase. The marble steps, polished to mirror brightness, required careful navigation even in the best circumstances. But distracted by Lucky's inexplicable coldness and her own hurt feelings, Ruth misjudged the distance to the next step. Her foot slipped on the smooth surface, and she felt herself falling backward toward the unforgiving marble below. Fear shot through her as she realized the 30-step staircase could easily kill her if she tumbled down its full length. Lucky moved with inhuman speed, reaching her before gravity could complete its cruel work. His arms snaked around her waist, pulling her against his chest as his other hand grasped the railing to anchor them both. The momentum carried them into the wall, Lucky's body shielding Ruth from the impact as they crashed against the ornate wallpaper. For a moment, they remained frozen in an embrace born of crisis. Ruth's heart hammered against Lucky's chest, her hands clutching his shirt as she processed how close she'd come to serious injury. Lucky's breathing was ragged, adrenaline flooding his system as he realized he'd almost watched her fall to potential death. Ruth. Her name emerged as a prayer of gratitude and terror. Are you hurt? She shook her head, not trusting her voice. Lucky's arm remained around her waist, his hand splayed across her lower back in a touch that was both protective and possessive. Ruth found herself studying the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair had fallen across his forehead, the intensity in his gray eyes that spoke of emotions far beyond employer concern. I could have lost you, Lucky whispered, the words emerging before he could stop them. The admission hung between them like a confession. Ruth's lips parted in surprise, her dark eyes searching his face for the meaning behind such raw honesty. Lucky. His name slipped out naturally, intimately, and she watched his pupils dilate at the sound. They were standing too close, breathing the same air, surrounded by the kind of charged atmosphere that made rational thought impossible. Lucky's thumb moved unconsciously against her back, and Ruth felt her resolve wavering like smoke in wind. The sharp click of Mrs. Faith's heels on marble shattered the moment like glass breaking. Lucky stepped back reluctantly, his hands falling away as they both struggled to regain professional composure. By the time the housekeeper rounded the corner, Ruth was examining the cleaning cloth with intense concentration, while Lucky studied the intricate crown molding as if seeing it for the first time. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Faith's tone suggested she suspected otherwise. "I heard a commotion." Miss Freeman slipped on the stairs, Lucky explained, his voice carefully controlled. "I was ensuring she wasn't injured." Mrs. Faith's sharp gaze missed nothing. Ruth's flushed cheeks, Lucky's slightly rumpled shirt, the residual tension that crackled between them, despite their obvious attempts at normalcy. "How fortunate that you were available to assist," she said dryly. Perhaps Miss Freeman should focus more carefully on her footing. The dismissive tone made Lucky's jaw tighten with protective anger. "The stairs are dangerously slippery when wet. We should consider having them treated with anti-slip coating." The fact that he was defending Ruth to his head housekeeper wasn't lost on any of them. Mrs. Faith's expression grew even more disapproving, while Ruth felt a flutter of warmth at his unexpected championship. "I'll look into it, sir." Mrs. Faith's tone suggested she'd be looking into considerably more than stair safety. "Miss Freeman, perhaps you should take a moment to collect yourself before continuing." Ruth nodded, gathering her supplies with movements that betrayed her lingering shakiness. As she headed toward the kitchen, she felt Lucky's gaze following her, and the sensation was both comforting and unsettling. Lucky remained on the staircase long after both women had departed, his hand pressed against the wall where Ruth's body had been pressed against his. The feel of her in his arms had awakened something primitive and protective, something that made Joseph's warnings seem irrelevant compared to the bone-deep certainty that he needed this woman in his life. The question was whether he had the courage to risk his heart again, and whether Ruth felt brave enough to bridge the impossible gap between their worlds. Later that evening, as Ruth prepared for her shift at the medical center, she found a small gift outside her door, a book of poetry by Pablo Neruda, with a note tucked inside the front cover. "For someone who understands that beauty and wisdom aren't determined by circumstances. Thank you for reminding me that living isn't a betrayal of loving. L." Ruth held the book against her chest, feeling tears prick her eyes. Whatever walls Lucky had tried to build that morning, this gesture suggested they were already crumbling. She didn't know that Lucky was watching from his office window, hoping that his peace offering might repair the damage his fears had caused. What both of them were beginning to understand was that some connections transcend logic, social boundaries, and even the protective mechanisms built around wounded hearts. The question wasn't whether they were falling for each other. That had become undeniably clear. The question was whether they possessed the courage to fall together, despite every rational reason why they should walk away. The poetry book became Ruth's most treasured possession, its worn pages offering comfort during the long stretches between her demanding jobs. She'd find herself reading Neruda's words about love transcending circumstances, and wondering if Lucky had chosen those particular poems intentionally. Their morning conversations resumed with new depth, though both maintained careful boundaries that felt increasingly artificial. Lucky would find excuses to linger near whatever room Ruth was cleaning, while she began timing her tasks to coincide with his restless wandering through the mansion. "You're reading the Neruda," Lucky observed one morning, noticing the book tucked into Ruth's cleaning caddy. Ruth felt heat climb her neck. "It's beautiful. Thank you for sharing it. Sarah introduced me to his work." Lucky's voice held its usual roughness when mentioning his wife. "She said poetry was love made visible through language." She sounds like someone who understood the power of words. Lucky studied Ruth's profile as she carefully arranged fresh flowers in Sarah's favorite vase. Over the weeks, He'd watched her move through his home with increasing familiarity, and her presence had begun to feel less like an intrusion and more like a homecoming he hadn't known he needed. She was brilliant, he said softly. Graduated summa cum laude from medical school, could speak 4 languages, had a memory that made computers seem inefficient. But she never made anyone feel lesser for knowing less. Ruth set down the flowers, hearing something in his tone that made her chest tighten. You feel guilty for loving her intelligence. The observation was so accurate it felt like a physical blow. Lucky's breath caught as he realized Ruth had identified a source of pain he'd never articulated, even to himself. I was never her intellectual equal, he admitted. Built my company through instinct and stubbornness, not academic brilliance. Sometimes I wondered what she saw in someone so human. Ruth's voice carried gentle challenge. Lucky, intelligence comes in many forms. The man who built a billion-dollar company from nothing possesses a kind of genius that can't be taught in schools. Sarah never made me feel inadequate, Lucky continued, needing to finish the thought. But others did. Her colleagues, her family. They saw me as the lucky bastard who won a prize he didn't deserve. Ruth turned to face him fully, her dark eyes blazing with protective anger that surprised them both. Anyone who looked at your wedding photos and thought you didn't deserve each other was blind. The way you looked at her, the way she looked at you, that was 2 people who'd found their perfect match. Lucky felt something shift in his chest at the fierce conviction in her voice. When was the last time someone had defended him with such passionate certainty? When was the last time someone had seen his worth without calculating his net worth? How do you know what perfect love looks like? He asked softly. Ruth's expression faltered, pain flickering across her features before she could hide it. I know what it doesn't look like. I know what it's like to have someone convince you that you're not worth staying for. The admission hung between them like an open wound. Lucky felt rage spike through him at the thought of someone making Ruth feel unworthy of love. The woman who moved through his house like grace personified, who spoke wisdom that healed wounds he hadn't known he carried, who looked at him like he was worthy of attention rather than just his bank account. Tell me about him, Lucky said, the words emerging rougher than intended. Ruth shook her head, returning to her flower arrangement with movements that had become agitated. It doesn't matter, it's over. It matters if it's still hurting you. The gentle insistence in his voice nearly undid her. Ruth gripped the vase edge, fighting against the tears that threatened to expose vulnerabilities she'd spent months carefully guarding. Mark Hammett, she said finally. We were together for 3 years. I thought we were building something real. I had a full scholarship to nursing school, was going to specialize in pediatrics. Mark said he supported my dreams, but apparently supporting them and paying for them were different things. Lucky felt cold fury building in his chest. He left you? He emptied our joint account and left a note explaining that nursing school was too expensive for someone like me, said I should focus on more realistic goals, like finding a man who could support me properly. Ruth's laugh held no humor. Turns out I wasn't realistic enough to keep him either. What happened to nursing school? Gone. Without the account money, I couldn't afford housing near campus or living expenses while attending classes. The scholarship covered tuition, but not survival. Ruth's voice grew smaller. I kept thinking if I worked hard enough, saved enough, I could try again. But the longer you're away from school, the harder it becomes to believe you belong there. Lucky watched emotions play across her expressive face. Grief for dreams deferred, anger at the man who'd stolen her future, and underneath it all, a bone-deep exhaustion that came from working multiple jobs while nursing a broken heart. You still want to be a nurse, he observed. I want a lot of things I can't have. Ruth's tone suggested the conversation was over, but Lucky wasn't ready to let it go. What if you could have them? Ruth looked at him sharply, suspicion clouding her features. I can't accept charity, Lucky. Not from you. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering investment in someone whose potential is being wasted cleaning other people's houses. Lucky stepped closer, his intensity making the air between them crackle. You have the intelligence, the compassion, the dedication. All you lack is opportunity. Opportunity that costs more money than I'll make in 5 years of cleaning. Money that means nothing to me, compared to watching you diminish yourself because some bastard convinced you that you weren't worth investing in. The words hung between them, loaded with meanings neither was ready to examine too closely. Ruth felt tears prick her eyes at the fierce conviction in Lucky's voice, the way he spoke about her potential, like it was precious and obvious. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you care what happens to me?" Lucky stared at her, watching tears gather in her dark eyes, and felt his careful control beginning to crack. Why did he care? When had Ruth Freeman become someone whose pain affected him more than his own? When had her dreams become as important to him as the empire he'd spent decades building? "Because you make me remember what it feels like to be alive," he said finally. "Because you look at me like I'm worthy of attention, not just my money. Because you're brilliant and kind, and you deserve to have someone believe in your dreams the way you've believed in mine, without even knowing them." Ruth felt her breath catch at the raw honesty in his voice. This wasn't the polished businessman or the grieving widower. This was Lucky Blackwood, stripped of all pretenses, offering her truth that felt more valuable than any monetary investment. "Lucky," she started, but he wasn't finished. "Because every morning at 4 a.m., I wait for the sound of your car in the driveway. Because you've made this mausoleum feel like a home again. Because when you smile, really smile, it's like watching sunrise after 2 years of winter." The confession hung between them, like a bridge neither had expected to build. Ruth felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she processed the implications of what he'd just revealed. He waited for her arrival. He treasured her smiles. He saw her as someone worthy of investment, worthy of belief, worthy of, "This is impossible," she whispered, though her body was already betraying her words by stepping closer to him. "Impossible things happen every day," Lucky said softly. "I built a company from nothing. You survived losing everything and still managed to maintain your compassion, your intelligence, your dignity. We're both experts at impossible." Ruth stared up at him, seeing past the expensive clothes and practiced composure to the man underneath. Someone who'd loved deeply, lost completely, and was somehow finding the courage to risk his heart again with a woman whose circumstances couldn't have been more different from his late wife's. "What are you saying?" she asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "I'm saying that somewhere between watching you dust my wife's photographs with reverence and listening to you speak wisdom that puts my expensive therapists to shame, I've fallen for you." Lucky's voice grew rough with emotion. "I'm saying that I haven't felt this alive since Sarah died, and I'm terrified and grateful in equal measure." Ruth felt tears spill over at the raw vulnerability in his admission. She'd dreamed of someone looking at her the way Lucky was looking at her now, like she was precious and necessary and deserving of devotion. But dreams and reality were different countries, and she lived firmly in the latter. "I'm your employee," she said weakly. "I clean your house for minimum wage while you run a billion-dollar empire. People like you don't fall for people like me." "People like me?" Lucky stepped closer, his intensity making the space between them feel charged with electricity. "You mean people who've forgotten how to sleep through the night? People who turn their homes into shrines because they were afraid of moving forward? People who measure worth in dollars because they've forgotten how to measure it in character?" Each question hit like a gentle blow, stripping away Ruth's preconceptions about wealth and privilege. "You think your circumstances define your worth," Lucky continued, his voice growing fierce with conviction. "But I see someone who works 3 jobs without complaint, who treats other people's grief with reverence, who speaks wisdom that comes from surviving pain and choosing kindness anyway. You think I'm above you, but the truth is, I've been trying to deserve your attention since the moment you steadied me on that ladder." "I steadied you?" Ruth laughed through her tears. "You caught me." "No," Lucky said softly, reaching up to trace the path of her tears with gentle fingers. "You caught me. You caught a man who was drowning in grief and showed him how to breathe again. The touch of his fingers against her cheek sent fire through Ruth's entire body. She'd never been touched with such reverence, such careful attention to her responses. Lucky's thumb brushed across her lower lip, and she felt her resolve crumbling like walls built on sand. "Lucky," she whispered, his name emerging as a prayer and a plea. "Say it again," he murmured, stepping close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Lucky." This time his name came out breathless, loaded with all the longing she'd been trying to deny. Lucky's other hand came up to frame her face, his thumbs continuing their gentle exploration of her cheekbones, her jaw, the sensitive skin just below her ears. Ruth's eyes fluttered closed at the sensation, her hands coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel his heart hammering with the same rhythm as her own. "I want to kiss you," Lucky said softly, his breath warm against her lips. "I want to kiss you so badly, I can barely think straight. But I need to know you want it too. I need to know this isn't gratitude or fear or anything other than genuine desire." Ruth opened her eyes to find him watching her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter with liquid heat. Here was a man worth billions, asking permission to kiss a woman who cleaned houses, and the request felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I want it too," she whispered. "I want you to kiss me. I want—" Lucky's mouth captured hers before she could finish the sentence, and the first touch of his lips sent shockwaves through her entire nervous system. The kiss started gentle, exploratory, a question asked and answered through the soft pressure of lips meeting for the first time. But when Ruth made a small sound of pleasure, and her hands fisted in his shirt pulling him closer, gentleness transformed into something deeper and more urgent. Lucky's arms came around her, one hand tangling in her hair while the other pressed against the small of her back, drawing her body against his until no space remained between them. Ruth had been kissed before, but never like this, never with such focused attention to her responses, never with such careful reverence combined with obvious desire. She could taste coffee on his tongue, could smell the expensive cologne that had become familiar from their close encounters, could feel the solid strength of his body against hers. But more than physical sensation, she could feel something fundamental shifting between them. Walls crumbling, defenses dissolving, two wounded hearts recognizing their perfect complement. Lucky deepened the kiss, his tongue exploring the softness of her mouth with gentle thoroughness that made Ruth's knees weak. She'd never experienced such complete focus from a man, such devoted attention to her pleasure. When he nipped gently at her lower lip, she made a sound that was part gasp, part moan, and felt him smile against her mouth. "Ruth," he murmured against her lips, her name emerging like a benediction. The sound of approaching footsteps shattered the moment like crystal breaking. They sprang apart just as Mrs. Faith rounded the corner, both breathing hard and struggling to regain composure that felt impossible after such earth-moving intimacy. Mrs. Faith took in Ruth's flushed cheeks, Lucky's rumpled shirt, and the charged atmosphere that seemed to pulse between them, despite their obvious attempts at professional distance. "Mr. Blackwood," she said coldly, "your 9 o'clock conference call is waiting in your office." Lucky ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to shift mental gears from passionate discovery to business obligations. "Of course. Thank you, Mrs. Faith." As he moved toward the door, he paused beside Ruth, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "This isn't finished." The promise sent heat spiraling through Ruth's body as she watched him walk away. She could still taste him on her lips, could still feel the imprint of his hands on her skin. Whatever had just happened between them had changed everything, and there was no going back to professional distance or casual friendship. Mrs. Faith remained in the doorway long after Lucky's footsteps had faded, her disapproving gaze fixed on Ruth with laser precision. "Miss Freeman," she said finally, her tone suggesting deep displeasure, "I trust you understand the temporary nature of your current arrangements." Ruth straightened her spine, meeting the housekeeper's gaze with quiet dignity. "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Faith." But as Ruth returned to her cleaning with movements that felt mechanical and disconnected, She wondered if anyone truly understood what was happening between her and Lucky. She certainly didn't understand how a kiss could feel like coming home and stepping off a cliff simultaneously. She didn't understand how Lucky Blackwood had become essential to her breathing in the space of a few weeks. What she did understand was that whatever existed between them felt too powerful to ignore and too dangerous to pursue. The taste of him lingered on her lips like a promise and a warning, and Ruth knew with bone-deep certainty that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Upstairs in his office, Lucky stared out the window toward the guest house, his conference call forgotten as he relived every second of kissing Ruth Freeman. He could still feel the softness of her skin under his fingers, could still taste the sweetness of her response, could still hear the small sounds of pleasure she'd made against his mouth. For the first time in 2 years, he felt fully alive. And for the first time since Sarah's death, he was ready to fight for something that mattered more than mere survival. The question was whether Ruth felt brave enough to fight alongside him, or whether the forces arrayed against them would prove stronger than the connection that had just transformed a simple kiss into a declaration of war against every rational reason they should stay apart. The kiss haunted them both through the following days, creating an electric undercurrent that made every interaction feel charged with unspoken possibility. Lucky found himself inventing reasons to be near whatever room Ruth was cleaning, while Ruth discovered that simple tasks like dusting had become exercises in hyper-awareness whenever he was present. Their conversations took on new layers of meaning. Professional exchanges about household schedules became loaded with subtext, and the careful distance they tried to maintain felt increasingly artificial. Mrs. Faith watched their interactions with the sharp attention of a hawk studying prey, her disapproval radiating through the mansion like a chill. "You're playing with fire," Joseph warned during their weekly business meeting, having noticed Lucky's improved mood and increased distraction. "Whatever's happening with the cleaning girl needs to stop before it becomes a scandal." Lucky's jaw tightened at the dismissive term. "Her name is Ruth Freeman, and she's considerably more than a cleaning girl. She's an employee, Lucky. The power dynamic alone makes this inappropriate, and the media would have a field day if they discovered the grieving widower billionaire was sleeping with the help." "I'm not sleeping with anyone," Lucky snapped, though the defensive tone revealed more than intended. Joseph studied his friend's face, recognizing the signs of a man fighting a losing battle against his own desires. "But you want to be. And that's exactly the problem." The accusation hit too close to home. Lucky did want Ruth, with an intensity that surprised him, a bone-deep craving that had nothing to do with mere physical attraction, and everything to do with the way she made him feel, fully alive for the first time in years. Meanwhile, Ruth struggled with her own internal war. Mark Hammett had reappeared in her life 3 days after the kiss, showing up at the medical center with his familiar charm and empty promises. Seeing him again reminded Ruth of every cruel word he'd spoken, every dream he'd helped destroy, every reason she'd learned not to trust men who claimed to care about her future. "You look good, Ruthie," Mark said, using the nickname that had once made her smile and now made her skin crawl. "Working suits you." "What do you want, Mark?" Ruth didn't pause in her cleaning, unwilling to give him more attention than absolutely necessary. "Can't a man check on his ex-girlfriend, make sure she's doing all right?" Ruth finally looked at him, seeing past the handsome features to the weakness underneath. Strange how clearly she could recognize his manipulative techniques now, when once they'd seemed like affection. "I'm fine. You can leave now." "Come on, don't be like that." Mark moved closer, his voice taking on the wheedling tone she remembered from their worst arguments. "I heard you're living in some rich guy's guest house now. Moving up in the world." The insinuation in his voice made Ruth's stomach turn. "It's temporary housing provided by my employer, nothing more." "Right." Mark's laugh held ugly undertones. "We both know you're not above using what you've got to improve your situation. Remember, I taught you everything you know about getting what you want from men." The cruel assessment hit like a physical blow, because it echoed every insecurity Ruth carried about her growing feelings for Lucky. Was she really falling for him? Or was she simply responding to his wealth and the security he represented? How could she trust her own emotions when Mark's betrayal had left her questioning every instinct? "Get out," Ruth said quietly, her voice shaking with anger and hurt. "I'm just saying, when your sugar daddy gets tired of playing house, don't come crying to me." Mark's parting shot followed him out the door, leaving Ruth feeling sick and confused. That evening, Ruth sat in the guest house, trying to lose herself in the Neruda poetry, but Mark's words kept echoing in her mind. Was she really so different from the gold digger he'd accused her of being? Lucky was offering her things she desperately needed: security, opportunity, the chance to return to nursing school. How could she separate genuine feelings from gratitude and self-interest? When a soft knock came at her door just after 10 p.m., Ruth's heart leaped with hope and terror in equal measure. She opened it to find Lucky standing on her doorstep, looking uncertain in a way she'd never seen before. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," he said, holding up a small bag from her favorite Chinese restaurant. "You missed dinner, and I thought you might be hungry." This simple gesture of care nearly undid her. When was the last time someone had noticed whether she'd eaten? When was the last time someone had cared enough to bring her comfort food just because they were thinking of her? "You didn't have to do that," Ruth said softly, stepping aside to let him enter. "I wanted to." Lucky set the bag on her kitchen counter, his movements careful and deliberate. "Ruth, about what happened yesterday?" "It was a mistake," Ruth interrupted, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "We both got caught up in the moment, but we need to maintain professional boundaries." Lucky turned to study her face, seeing the pain she was trying to hide behind professional composure. "Look at me and tell me it felt like a mistake." Ruth kept her gaze fixed on the takeout bag, unwilling to meet his eyes because she knew he'd see the truth written in her expression. "It doesn't matter how it felt. It matters what's realistic." "Realistic according to whom? Mrs. Faith? Joseph? Some arbitrary set of social rules that say people from different backgrounds can't find happiness together?" "Realistic according to the fact that you're worth billions, and I'm working 3 jobs to survive," Ruth shot back, her composure finally cracking. "Realistic according to the fact that this is your world, and I'm just visiting it temporarily." Lucky felt frustration spike through him at her stubborn insistence on viewing their connection through the lens of economics, rather than emotion. "You think this is about money? Isn't it always?" Ruth's voice carried years of accumulated hurt. "Men like you don't fall for women like me unless there's something in it for them. And women like me don't fall for men like you unless we're hoping to improve our circumstances." The bitter assessment hit Lucky like a slap. "Is that really what you think of me? That I'm some predator looking to take advantage of your situation?" "I think you're lonely and grieving, and I happen to be convenient." Ruth's voice grew smaller with each word. "I think when the novelty wears off, you'll realize what everyone else already knows. That we don't belong together." Lucky stared at her, seeing past her defensive words to the deep-seated insecurity that drove them. Someone had convinced this brilliant, compassionate woman that she wasn't worthy of genuine love. And the knowledge made him want to hunt down Mark Hammett and explain exactly what happened to men who destroyed other people's self-worth. "He was here today, wasn't he?" Lucky said quietly. "Mark." Ruth's sharp intake of breath confirmed his suspicion. "How did you? Because yesterday you kissed me like I was oxygen and you'd been drowning. Today you're looking at me like I'm the enemy. What did he say to you?" Ruth wrapped her arms around herself, feeling exposed and vulnerable under Lucky's penetrating gaze. "He reminded me of who I really am. What I really am. And what's that? Someone who uses people to get what she wants. Someone who's good at making men feel important until she gets what she needs from them." The words emerged like confessions dragged from a guilty conscience. Lucky felt rage spike through him, so pure and fierce it took his breath away. "That bastard really did a number on you, didn't he?" "He wasn't wrong," Ruth whispered. "Look at this situation, Lucky. You're offering me everything I want: security, the chance to go back to school, a way out of the life that's been slowly killing me. How do I know my feelings for you are real and not just gratitude dressed up as love?" Lucky moved closer, his intensity making the air between them crackle with electricity. Because gratitude doesn't make your breath catch when I walk into a room. Gratitude doesn't make you look at me like I hung the stars when I bring you Chinese food. Gratitude doesn't make you kiss me like the world is ending and I may only salvation. Each observation hit like a gentle blow, stripping away Ruth's defenses with surgical precision. You want to know how I know your feelings are real? Lucky continued, stepping close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Because you're trying to talk yourself out of them. Because you're so terrified of being hurt again that you'd rather push me away than risk discovering what we could have together. Ruth felt tears prick her eyes at the raw understanding in his voice. What if you're wrong? What if I disappoint you the way I disappointed him? You didn't disappoint Mark Hammett, Lucky said fiercely. Mark Hammett was a small, weak man who couldn't handle being with someone stronger and more brilliant than himself. He tore you down because building you up would have required him to grow, and men like that don't grow. They diminish everyone around them until they feel adequate. The passionate defense nearly broke Ruth's resolve completely. When was the last time someone had spoken about her with such protective fury? When was the last time someone had seen her potential rather than her limitations? Lucky, she whispered, his name emerging as a prayer. I know you're scared, he said softly, reaching up to trace the path of her tears with gentle fingers. I'm terrified too. I never thought I'd feel this way about anyone again. But what we have is real, Ruth. It's real and it's worth fighting for. Ruth felt her last defenses crumbling as she looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw her own longing reflected back at her. What are you saying? I'm saying I don't care about the money or the social differences or what anyone else thinks is appropriate. Lucky's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones with reverent attention. I'm saying I'm falling in love with you, and I think you're falling in love with me too. The confession hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Ruth felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she processed the implications of what he'd just revealed. This is crazy, she whispered, though her hands were already coming up to rest against his chest. The best things usually are. Lucky's voice grew rough with emotion. Sarah used to say that love wasn't logical, it was necessary. And you, Ruth Freeman, have become absolutely necessary to me. Ruth felt tears spill over at the raw vulnerability in his admission. Here was a man who'd loved and lost completely, who'd built walls around his heart that seemed impenetrable, offering her everything he had to give. Unscared, she whispered. So am I. Lucky's thumb traced her lower lip with gentle reverence. But I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been if we were brave enough to try. Ruth searched his eyes, seeing past the wealth and privilege to the man underneath, someone who'd survived devastating loss and was somehow finding the courage to love again. In that moment, she made a choice that felt like jumping off a cliff and growing wings simultaneously. Lucky, she whispered, rising on her toes to close the distance between them. This time, when their lips met, there was no hesitation, no careful exploration. This was hunger and need, and two people finally surrendering to something that had been building between them since the moment they first touched. Lucky's arms came around her, lifting her slightly as he deepened the kiss, and Ruth felt herself melting into him with complete abandon. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lucky rested his forehead against hers, his eyes dark with desire and something deeper. Stay with me tonight, he whispered, the request, emerging raw and vulnerable. Not because of what I can give you, or what you think you owe me. Stay because you want to, because you feel what I feel. Ruth looked into his eyes and saw her own longing reflected back at her, magnified and made sacred by the depth of emotion behind it. This wasn't about money or security or gratitude. This was about two wounded souls recognizing their perfect complement. Yes, she whispered, the word emerging like a vow. Lucky's smile was brilliant and tender as he lifted her into his arms, carrying her toward the bedroom with careful reverence. The guest house had never felt near like sanctuary, a place apart from the world where class differences and social expectations couldn't touch them. In the soft lamplight, with rain pattering gently against the windows, Lucky set Ruth on her feet beside the bed. His hands came up to frame her face again, his touch gentle and worshipful. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "Not just physically, but you take my breath away. But your spirit, your strength, the way you've survived everything life threw at you, and still managed to maintain your compassion." Ruth felt fresh tears gather at the genuine admiration in his voice. Mark had never spoken to her with such reverence, had never looked at her like she was precious and miraculous. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Lucky continued, his fingers tracing the delicate line of her jaw. "After Sarah died, I thought that part of me died too. But you've awakened something I thought was gone forever." "Lucky," Ruth whispered, overwhelmed by the intensity of his devotion. "I want to worship you the way you deserve," he said softly. "I want to show you how precious you are, how much you mean to me. Will you let me?" Ruth felt her breath catch at the reverent question. No one had ever asked permission to cherish her before. No one had ever made her feel like her consent was sacred, like her pleasure was the most important thing in the world. "Yes," she breathed, and watched his eyes darken with desire and tenderness. Lucky's hands moved to the buttons of her uniform, with careful attention, his fingers working slowly as if unwrapping the most precious gift. With each piece of clothing that fell away, he murmured words of appreciation and desire, mapping her body with hands and lips, and whispered endearments that made her feel like a goddess being worshipped at her own altar. When they came together in the soft lamplight, it was with a reverence that transformed physical union into something approaching prayer. Lucky moved with careful attention to her responses, his every touch designed to bring her pleasure. His every kiss a promise of devotion that transcended the physical act itself. Ruth had never experienced such focused attention, such devoted care for her enjoyment. With Lucky, she felt truly seen, truly cherished, truly worthy of the kind of love she'd only read about in poetry. When release finally claimed them both, it was with a completeness that felt like coming home after years of wandering in the wilderness. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the tangled sheets, Lucky traced lazy patterns on Ruth's skin while she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I love you," Lucky whispered into the darkness, the words emerging without conscious thought. Ruth lifted her head to look at him, seeing truth shining in his storm-gray eyes. "I love you too," she whispered back, the admission feeling like the most natural thing in the world. Lucky's smile was brilliant and tender as he pulled her up for a kiss that tasted like promises and possibility. For the first time in 2 years, he felt complete. For the first time in her life, Ruth felt truly cherished. Neither of them knew that in a few short weeks, their perfect union would create new life. Twins that would complicate their love story in ways they couldn't imagine. Neither of them knew that forces were already moving against them, that Jerry White's investigators had begun their surveillance, that their happiness would soon be tested by threats they couldn't anticipate. All they knew was that they'd found something worth fighting for, something that transcended logic and social boundaries and every rational reason they should have stayed apart. In the quiet sanctuary of the guest house, surrounded by rain and lamplight and the kind of love that changes everything, Lucky and Ruth began planning a future neither had dared to imagine. What they didn't know was that some futures come with prices neither lover expects to pay, and that the greatest tests of love often come not from external obstacles, but from the courage required to trust in something that feels too good to be true. But for now, in this perfect moment, love felt like the most natural thing in the world, and tomorrow's challenges seemed impossibly distant compared to the immediate miracle of finding their perfect match in the most unexpected place. The weeks following their first night together passed in a golden haze of stolen moments and growing intimacy. Lucky and Ruth maintained professional facades during household hours, but their connection had deepened beyond mere physical attraction into something that felt both inevitable and miraculous. Lucky found himself rearranging his schedule to coincide with Ruth's shifts. and their morning conversations evolved into elaborate discussions about everything from literature to business strategy. Ruth's insights consistently surprised him, her intelligence shaped by real-world experience rather than formal education, often cut through complex problems with startling clarity. "You should sit in on the Henderson Industries merger meeting," Lucky suggested one morning, watching Ruth organize his business papers with effortless efficiency. "Your perspective on employee retention during acquisitions could be valuable." Ruth paused in her filing, studying his face for signs that he was patronizing her. Finding only genuine respect, she felt warmth bloom in her chest. "You really think my opinion matters?" "I think your opinion matters more than most of my board members." Lucky's smile held the kind of tenderness that made her stomach flutter with liquid heat. "You understand people in ways that Harvard MBAs never learned." Their secret relationship created constant tension. Professional meetings became exercises in restraint, forcing them to maintain composure while remembering passionate nights in the guest house. Lucky's touch, even accidentally brushing her hand while passing documents, sent electricity through Ruth's entire nervous system. The physical tension reached breaking point during a formal dinner party Lucky hosted for potential investors. Ruth served wine and hors d'oeuvres with professional composure, but watching her move through the crowded rooms while burning to touch her created an almost unbearable ache in Lucky's chest. When Ruth leaned over his shoulder to refill his wine glass, her subtle perfume, mixed with the warmth of her skin, made Lucky's hands clench with the effort not to pull her into his lap. The brief contact of her wrist against his shoulder sent fire racing through his bloodstream. "Careful," Ruth murmured, her voice pitched for his ears alone as she steadied the wine bottle. "Your guests will notice if you keep looking at me like that." "Then stop being so beautiful," Lucky replied under his breath, his voice rough with suppressed desire. Ruth's breath caught at the raw hunger in his tone, and she had to force herself to move away before their carefully maintained professional distance crumbled completely. Later that evening, after the last guest departed, Lucky found Ruth in the kitchen finishing cleanup duties. The formal dining room felt like neutral territory compared to the charged atmosphere that always surrounded them when alone. "They're gone," Lucky said softly, watching her hands still on the wine glasses she was washing. Ruth turned slowly, seeing the desire that blazed in his storm-gray eyes despite his controlled exterior. The evening of enforced distance had wound them both tight as springs, and the sudden privacy felt electric with possibility. "Mrs. Faith retired an hour ago," Ruth observed, her voice emerging breathier than intended. Lucky moved closer, his intensity making the spacious kitchen feel intimate and charged. "So we're alone." "Completely alone." Ruth set down the wine glass with trembling fingers, hyper-aware of Lucky's approach. When he reached her, Lucky's hands came up to frame her face with the reverent attention that always made her feel precious and necessary. "Do you have any idea how difficult it was to watch you serve wine to other men when all I wanted was to announce to the room that you're mine?" The possessive declaration sent heat spiraling through Ruth's body. She'd never experienced such focused desire, such devoted attention to her responses and needs. "Lucky," she whispered, rising on her toes to meet his descending mouth. Their kiss was hungry and desperate, weeks of suppressed tension exploding into passion that made rational thought impossible. Lucky lifted Ruth onto the marble counter, stepping between her legs as his hands tangled in her hair. Ruth's uniform skirt rode up around her thighs, and Lucky's touch on her bare skin made her gasp against his mouth. "Not here," Ruth managed between kisses, though her body was already betraying her words by arching into his touch. "The guest house," Lucky agreed roughly, lifting her from the counter and carrying her toward the door with determined strides. Their lovemaking that night possessed an urgency that transcended their usual tender exploration. Weeks of stolen glances and professional restraint had built pressure that demanded release, and they came together with a passion that felt both desperate and sacred. But their perfect bubble of secrecy was about to be shattered by forces beyond their control. The next morning, Ruth woke feeling queasy and disoriented. She attributed the nausea to stress and exhaustion, but when the symptoms persisted for several days, a terrible possibility began forming in her mind. The pregnancy test's positive result felt like staring at a bomb with a lit fuse. Ruth sat on the guest house bathroom floor, trembling as the implications crashed over her like waves. She was pregnant with Lucky's child, a complication that could destroy everything they'd built together. For 3 days, Ruth carried the secret like a weight pressing against her chest. She watched Lucky's face for signs that he suspected, but he seemed focused on business pressures and upcoming board meetings. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was carrying the child of a billionaire who'd made his fortune in family planning technology. Yet she had no idea how to tell him about their unexpected pregnancy. The decision was made for her when Dr. Barbara Smith called with test results that changed everything. "Miss Freeman, I need you to come in immediately." The doctor's voice carried unusual urgency. "The blood work shows something unexpected." Ruth's hands trembling as she gripped the phone. "What kind of unexpected?" "You're carrying twins, Miss Freeman, and giving your symptoms and rapid hormone elevation. We need to discuss proper prenatal care immediately." Twins. Ruth felt the world tilt around her as she processed the information. She wasn't just pregnant. She was carrying 2 babies that would bind her to Lucky forever, whether he wanted that connection or not. That afternoon, as Ruth walked through the mansion's gardens trying to process her new reality, a sleek black sedan pulled through the estate gates. The man who emerged wore expensive suits and predatory confidence like armor. Jerry White, Lucky's father, and the most dangerous person in Lucky's carefully controlled world. Ruth had never met Jerry White, but his resemblance to Lucky was unmistakable, despite the cold calculation in his eyes, where Lucky possessed warmth and depth. This was a man who measured everything in terms of power and profit, and Ruth immediately understood why Lucky had built his life in careful opposition to his father's values. "Miss Freeman," Jerry's voice carried the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. "We need to talk." Ruth felt ice form in her stomach as she realized Lucky's father had sought her out deliberately. "I'm working, Mr. White. Perhaps you should speak with Mr. Blackwood if you need something." "Oh, but you're exactly what I need to speak with." Jerry's smile held no warmth. "You see, I've been watching this little romance develop between you and my son, and I'm here to make you an offer." The words hit like physical blows. Jerry White knew about their relationship, which meant others probably knew as well. The secrecy that had protected them was already compromised. "I don't know what you think you've seen," Ruth started, but Jerry's laugh cut her off. "Please, I have photographs, Miss Freeman. Very compelling photographs of you and Lucky in intimate situations. My security team is quite thorough." Ruth felt sick as she realized they'd been under surveillance, that their most private moments had been violated and documented. The violation felt like a physical assault. "What do you want?" she managed. Jerry reached into his jacket and withdrew a check. The amount visible even from Ruth's distance, $500,000, more money than she could earn in a lifetime of cleaning houses. "I want you to disappear," Jerry said simply. "Take this money, leave town, never contact my son again. In return, I'll ensure you never have to work another menial job in your life." Ruth stared at the check, feeling trapped between impossible choices. With twins coming, that money could provide security she'd never imagined. But taking it would mean betraying Lucky, abandoning the first real love she'd ever known. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Jerry's expression turned arctic. "Then those photographs become public. Lucky's reputation is destroyed, his business partnerships collapse, and you become known as the gold-digging cleaning lady who seduced a grieving widower. Your sister Linda McCary's teaching position at Jefferson Elementary becomes untenable. Amazing how scandal spreads to family members." The threat against Linda hit like a knife between Ruth's ribs. Her sister was the only family she had left, and Linda's teaching career meant everything to her. Jerry White had obviously researched Ruth thoroughly, identifying exactly which pressure points would destroy her resistance. "You're a monster," Ruth whispered. "I'm a businessman protecting my investment." Jerry's tone remained conversational despite the evil nature of his words. Lucky has been groomed to inherit an empire worth billions. I won't allow some nobody with a high school education to derail decades of careful planning. Ruth felt tears of rage and helplessness prick her eyes. Lucky loves me. Lucky thinks he loves you. There's a difference. Jerry stepped closer, his presence radiating menace. Love fades, Miss Freeman, but the damage you could do to his reputation and business relationships would be permanent. Do you really want to be responsible for destroying everything he's worked to build? The manipulation was surgical in its precision, targeting every insecurity Ruth carried about their relationship. Was she really good for Lucky, or was she a beautiful disaster waiting to destroy everything he'd accomplished? I need time to think, Ruth managed. You have 24 hours. Jerry tucked the check into her hand with movements that felt like violation. After that, the photographs go public, and your sister's career becomes collateral damage. Choose wisely, Miss Freeman. After Jerry's sedan disappeared through the gates, Ruth sank onto a garden bench, feeling like her world had just collapsed. The pregnancy she'd discovered that morning felt like a complication beyond her ability to handle, and Jerry's ultimatum had turned her greatest joy into her most dangerous liability. That evening, Lucky found Ruth in the guest house, staring out the window with an expression that made his chest tighten with concern. You're upset, he observed, moving to sit beside her on the couch. What happened? Ruth looked at him, this man she'd come to love with desperate intensity, and felt her heart breaking. How could she tell him about the pregnancy when Jerry's threats made their future impossible? How could she destroy his life by refusing to disappear when staying meant bringing scandal and ruin to everything he'd built? Ruth, Lucky's voice grew urgent as he took in her pale complexion and the tears she was fighting to hide. Talk to me. Whatever's wrong. We'll figure it out together. The gentle promise nearly destroyed her resolve. This was why she loved him, his immediate instinct to protect and support her, his absolute faith that their connection could overcome any obstacle. But some obstacles were too large for love to conquer. I'm pregnant, Ruth said quietly, the words emerging like confessions dragged from a guilty conscience. Lucky went completely still, his face cycling through surprise, wonder, and something that looked like fierce joy before settling into protective determination. Pregnant, he repeated, as if testing the word. With my child. With your children, Ruth corrected, her voice barely above a whisper. Twins. Lucky's face transformed with an expression of such pure happiness that Ruth felt her heart shatter completely. Here was a man who'd lost everything once before, now facing the possibility of creating new life with the woman he loved, and his first instinct was joy rather than fear. Twins, Lucky breathed, reaching for her hands with trembling fingers. Ruth, this is incredible. This is impossible, Ruth interrupted, pulling away from his touch because contact made rational thought impossible. Lucky, we can't do this. I can't do this. Lucky's expression shifted to confusion and hurt. You don't want children? I want your children more than I want my next breath, Ruth said fiercely, the confession torn from her heart. But wanting something and being able to have it are different things. The pregnancy is just a complication we can't afford. Complication? Lucky's voice turned sharp with offense. These are our children you're talking about. Our future. Ruth stood abruptly, pacing to the window because distance felt necessary for what came next. There is no our future, Lucky. There's your billion-dollar empire and your reputation and your carefully planned life, and there's me, a pregnant cleaning lady who's about to become the scandal that destroys everything you've worked for. Lucky rose and moved toward her, his face dark with confusion and growing anger. What are you talking about? Where is this coming from? Ruth thought about Jerry's photographs, his threats against Linda, the check burning in her pocket like evidence of her own corruption. How could she explain that bare love had been turned into a weapon against everything Lucky held dear? It's coming from reality, she said finally. From the fact that fairy tales don't happen to women like me, and men like you don't get happy endings with the help. Stop calling yourself that, Lucky snapped, his patience finally fraying. You're not the help. You're the woman I love, the woman carrying my children, the woman I want to spend my life with." Ruth felt her resolve wavering at the fierce conviction in his voice. This was Lucky at his most compelling, passionate, protective, absolutely certain of what he wanted. But certainty didn't change reality, and reality included Jerry White's threats and the photographs that could destroy Lucky's carefully built life. "Love isn't enough," Ruth whispered, the words feeling like glass in her throat. "Love doesn't change the fact that we come from different worlds. Love doesn't make me suitable to be the mother of your children or the partner of a billionaire." Lucky stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "You're the most suitable woman I've ever met. You're brilliant, compassionate, strong. I'm a high school graduate who cleans houses for a living," Ruth said brutally. "And now I'm a pregnant high school graduate who cleans houses for a living. Your board of directors, your business partners, your entire social circle. They'll take one look at me and know exactly what I am. And what's that?" Ruth met his eyes, letting him see the pain she'd been hiding. "A mistake you'll regret making." The words hung between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. Lucky felt something cold and terrible growing in his chest as he realized Ruth was serious about walking away from their relationship, from their children, from everything they built together. "This isn't you talking," he said finally. "Someone got to you. Someone convinced you that we don't belong together." Ruth's sharp intake of breath confirmed his suspicion, but she turned away before he could read her expression. "It doesn't matter who said what," she managed. "What matters is that they're right." "They're not right," Lucky said fiercely, moving to stand behind her. "They're threatened by what we have because it proves their whole worldview wrong. They can't stand the idea that love might be more powerful than social expectations." Ruth closed her eyes, feeling Lucky's warmth at her back and wanting nothing more than to lean into his strength. But Jerry's threats echoed in her mind, reminding her of everything she stood to lose, and everything Lucky stood to lose if she stayed. "I'm leaving," she said quietly. "Tonight, I'll pack my things and be gone before morning." Lucky felt the words hit like physical blows. "Ruth, no. We can work through this. Whatever they threatened, whatever they promised, we can handle it together." "There is no together," Ruth said, turning to face him with tears streaming down her cheeks. "There never really was. I was fooling myself, thinking I could belong in your world. And you were fooling yourself thinking it didn't matter that we're from different planets." Lucky reached for her, desperate to bridge the growing distance between them. "Ruth, please. These are our children, our family. Don't throw that away because of fear." Ruth stepped back from his touch, knowing that physical contact would destroy her resolve completely. "I'm not throwing it away. I'm protecting you from a mistake that would cost you everything." "You're not a mistake," Lucky said desperately. "You're the best thing that's happened to me since Sarah died. You're my second chance at happiness." The reference to Sarah nearly broke Ruth's resolve. She could see the genuine love in Lucky's eyes, could feel the truth of his devotion like a physical force. But love didn't change economics, and economics didn't change the power Jerry White wielded over both their lives. "Your second chance at happiness is someone from your own world," Ruth said gently. "Someone who won't bring scandal and complications to your doorstep. Someone who deserves the life you're offering." Lucky stared at her, seeing past her defensive words to the deep-seated pain that drove them. Someone had convinced this remarkable woman that she wasn't worthy of love, and the knowledge filled him with rage and desperate determination. "I don't want someone from my world," he said fiercely. "I want you, only you, forever." Ruth felt her heart shatter at the raw honesty in his voice. Here was everything she'd ever wanted. A man who loved her completely, who saw her worth, who wanted to build a life and family with her. And she was about to walk away from it all to protect him from consequences he couldn't imagine. "I'm sorry," she whispered, moving toward the bedroom to pack. "I'm so sorry, Lucky, but this is how it has to be." As Ruth disappeared into the bedroom, Lucky stood in the guest house living room, feeling like his world was collapsing for the second time in his life. The woman he loved was carrying his children and walking away to protect him from unnamed threats. and he had no idea how to fight an enemy he couldn't identify or understand. What he didn't know was that sometimes love required sacrifice, and sometimes the greatest act of love was walking away from everything you wanted to protect the person you couldn't live without. But he was about to learn that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the cost, and that letting Ruth Freeman walk out of his life would be the one mistake he'd never forgive himself for making. Ruth packed her meager belongings with trembling hands, each item feeling like another piece of her heart being torn away. The poetry book Lucky had given her lay open on the bed, Neruda's words about love transcending circumstances, mocking her current reality. She closed it gently, unable to take something so precious when she was about to break the giver's heart. Lucky stood in the doorway, watching her systematic destruction of their shared life, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and desperate determination. "This is insane," he said finally. "Whatever they threatened, whatever they promised, we can face it together. I have resources, Ruth. I can protect you." Ruth folded her uniform with mechanical precision, not trusting herself to look at him. "You can't protect me from reality, Lucky. You can't change the fact that I'm nobody special, and you're worth billions." "You're carrying my children," Lucky said fiercely. "That makes you the most important person in my world." The words merely shattered her resolve. Ruth gripped the dresser edge, fighting tears that would only make leading harder. Those children deserve better than a mother who brings scandal to their father's life. Those children deserve parents who love each other and are brave enough to fight for their family. Ruth finally turned to face him, letting him see the tears she could no longer hide. "What if fighting means losing everything? What if my staying destroys your business, your reputation, everything you've worked to build?" Lucky moved closer, his intensity making the small bedroom feel charged with electricity. "Then we'll build something new together. Ruth, empires can be rebuilt, reputations can be restored, but what we have, this connection, this love, these children, that's irreplaceable." The passionate declaration nearly broke her completely. This was why she loved him, his willingness to sacrifice everything for the people he cared about, his absolute faith that love could conquer any obstacle. But Jerry White's threats weren't obstacles love could overcome. They were weapons designed to destroy everything Lucky had worked to achieve. "I can't let you sacrifice your life for me," Ruth whispered, "and I can't let you sacrifice our family for some misguided attempt to protect me." Lucky reached for her hands, his touch gentle, despite the desperation in his voice. "Ruth, please, tell me who threatened you. Tell me what they said. Let me help." Ruth pulled away from his touch, knowing that physical contact would destroy her resolve. "No one threatened me. I just realized that some dreams are too expensive to pursue." Lucky stared at her, seeing through the lie but unable to force the truth from her. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "I don't know what they said to convince you we can't be together, but I'm not giving up on us. I'm not giving up on our children." Ruth picked up her suitcase, each step toward the door, feeling like walking through quicksand. "Goodbye, Lucky. I hope someday you'll understand that leaving was the kindest thing I could do. The kindest thing would be staying and fighting for our family," Lucky called after her. But Ruth was already walking away from everything she'd ever wanted. Lucky followed her to the driveway, watching her load her battered Honda with possessions that represented an entire life lived on society's margins. The sight of her struggling with the heavy suitcase while pregnant with his twins filled him with protective rage. "At least tell me where you're going," he pleaded. "Let me know you and the babies are safe." Ruth paused with her hand on the car door, memorizing his face in the porch light. She wanted to remember him like this, concerned, loving, willing to fight the entire world for their happiness. Not the way he'd look when Jerry White's photographs destroyed his reputation and business relationships. "Take care of yourself, Lucky," she said softly. "You deserve happiness. Just find it with someone who won't cost you everything." Ruth drove away without looking back, knowing that seeing Lucky's face in the rearview mirror would make her turn around and damn the consequences. She made it 3 blocks before pulling over to sob until her chest ached and breathing felt impossible. The next few months passed in a blur of survival and increasing desperation. Ruth found work cleaning office buildings downtown, but the physical demands of the job became impossible as her pregnancy progressed. The twins made her show much earlier than single pregnancies, and her obvious condition made employers nervous about liability and lost productivity. Mark Hammett reappeared like a vulture drawn to weakness, offering temporary shelter in exchange for access to her remaining savings. Ruth's desperation made her accept his poisonous help, a decision she regretted when he stole the last of her money and disappeared again, leaving her homeless and nearly destitute. Jerry White's influence extended further than Ruth had imagined. Jobs mysteriously disappeared after interviews. Apartment applications were denied despite clean references, and opportunities evaporated whenever potential employers made background calls. She was being systematically isolated and impoverished, pushed toward desperation that would make Jerry's original offer seem reasonable. Meanwhile, Lucky descended into a darkness that terrified everyone around him. He threw himself into work with manic intensity, as if building more wealth could somehow compensate for losing the only thing that truly mattered. Joseph Denny watched his friend's transformation with growing alarm. "You're destroying yourself," Joseph observed during one of their increasingly tense business meetings. "Whatever happened with that woman, you need to move on." "Her name is Ruth Freeman," Lucky said coldly, "and she's carrying my children. I don't move on from family." "Children you've never seen medical confirmation for," Joseph pointed out. "Lucky, I know this is painful, but consider the possibility that she was using you. The pregnancy claim could be manipulation designed to secure financial support." Lucky's rage was swift and arctic. "Ruth doesn't lie, and she refused every offer of financial support I made. If she was using me for money, she did a remarkably poor job of it." Joseph recognized the dangerous territory he was entering, but pressed forward anyway. "Then why did she leave? Why walk away from the father of her children, unless the children don't exist or aren't yours?" Lucky stood abruptly, his control finally snapping. "Because someone convinced her that staying would destroy me. Because someone threatened her with consequences she couldn't bear. Because Ruth Freeman has more integrity in her little finger than most people have in their entire bodies." The passionate defense silenced Joseph, who was beginning to understand that Lucky's devotion to Ruth transcended rational business considerations. His friend was in love with a depth that made everything else secondary, including the empire they'd spent decades building. Ruth's situation grew increasingly desperate as winter approached. Working while heavily pregnant with twins had become nearly impossible, and her savings had dwindled to nothing. She'd lost her apartment and had been sleeping in her car for 2 weeks, moving between different parking lots to avoid police attention. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. She was homeless and hungry while carrying the children of a billionaire, too proud to ask for help from the man whose life she'd walked away to protect. Jerry White's surveillance had ensured Lucky remained unaware of her deteriorating circumstances, and Ruth's own stubborn pride prevented her from reaching out. On a particularly cold November night, exhaustion and hypothermia finally overcame Ruth's determination to stay hidden. She parked her Honda outside the Blackwood estate gates, telling herself she just needed to rest somewhere that felt safe. The mansion's lights glowed like beacons through the darkness, reminding her of mornings when she'd felt cherished and necessary. Ruth had no intention of approaching the house or letting Lucky see her condition. She simply wanted to sleep somewhere that carried memories of happiness, somewhere she could pretend for a few hours that love stories sometimes had happy endings. She wrapped herself in the threadbare blanket she'd been using for warmth and tried to find a comfortable position in the driver's seat despite her swollen belly. The twins seemed to sense her distress, moving restlessly as if trying to comfort their mother through kicks and flutters that had once filled her with joy. "I'm sorry," Ruth whispered to her unborn children, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I'm sorry I can't give you the life you deserve. I'm sorry your father doesn't know you exist. I'm sorry love wasn't enough to overcome reality." Lucky stood at his bedroom window, another sleepless night stretching endlessly before him. 2 months without Ruth felt like 2 years, and the approaching holidays only emphasized the emptiness that had consumed his life. He'd hired private investigators to locate her, but their searches had yielded nothing useful. Ruth Freeman had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. Movement near the estate gates caught his attention, a small car parked in shadows where no car should be. Lucky's heart stopped as he recognized the battered Honda, the same vehicle that had brought Ruth to his life and carried her away from it. Lucky threw on clothes and ran downstairs, his bare feet slipping on marble floors in his haste to reach the woman who'd haunted his dreams for months. The November air cut through his thin shirt, but adrenaline kept him warm as he approached the car with trembling hands. Ruth was asleep in the driver's seat, her face pale with exhaustion and cold. But what stopped Lucky's breath completely was her obviously pregnant belly, rounded with the unmistakable evidence of advanced pregnancy. She hadn't been lying about carrying his children. She was massively pregnant and sleeping in her car in near-freezing temperatures. Lucky tapped gently on the window, not wanting to startle her. Ruth's eyes opened slowly, focusing on his face with the confused recognition of someone emerging from deep sleep. For a moment, they simply stared at each other through the glass. Two people who'd loved completely and lost everything. Ruth's face crumpled as she realized Lucky had found her at her lowest point. She'd wanted to spare him this image of her desperation, this evidence of how completely she'd failed to survive without him. Ruth. Lucky's voice was muffled by the glass but carried clearly through the thin barrier. Open the door, please. Ruth shook her head, unable to speak past the tears that clogged her throat. How could she explain that she was homeless and hungry while carrying his children? How could she admit that Jerry White's threats had driven her to this desperate state? Lucky tried the door handle and found it unlocked. He opened it carefully, immediately hit by the cold air that had been Ruth's only shelter. The car smelled of desperation and fear, and Lucky felt rage build in his chest at whoever had driven the woman he loved to such desperate circumstances. My God, Ruth, he breathed, taking in her pale complexion and the way her clothes hung loose everywhere except around her swollen belly. How long have you been living like this? Ruth couldn't answer past the sobs that shook her exhausted frame. Lucky reached into the car and lifted her gently, carrying her toward the mansion with movements that suggested she was made of spun glass. I've got you, he murmured against her hair. I've got you and I'm never letting you go again. Ruth buried her face against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent that had haunted her dreams for months. Lucky, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Shh, Lucky soothed, carrying her through the mansion's front door and toward his private study where a fire burned warmly. We'll talk later. Right now we need to get you warm and fed. Lucky settled Ruth on the leather sofa closest to the fireplace, wrapping her in the cashmere throw Sarah had once used for reading. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was using his late wife's favorite blanket to comfort the woman carrying his children. Mrs. Faith, Lucky called, his voice carrying through the mansion with unusual urgency. The housekeeper appeared within minutes, her disapproving expression transforming to shock when she saw Ruth's condition. Call Dr. Harrison immediately, Lucky ordered. Tell him it's an emergency pregnancy situation, and prepare the blue guest suite. Mrs. Freeman will be staying here. The title correction wasn't lost on Mrs. Faith, whose expression suggested she understood that Ruth's status in the household had just changed permanently. As they waited for the doctor, Lucky knelt beside the sofa, studying Ruth's face with the desperate attention of a man who thought he'd lost everything. The babies, he said softly, his hand hovering over her rounded belly. Are they twins? Ruth whispered, finally meeting his eyes. They're due in 6 weeks. They're yours, Lucky. They've always been yours. Lucky felt emotions crash over him like waves, relief, joy, protective fury, and something that felt like coming back to life after months of merely existing. Ruth, he said carefully, I need to know what happened. I need to know who threatened you, who drove you to this, because I'm going to destroy them. Ruth saw the dangerous promise in his storm-gray eyes and felt fresh tears gather. Your father, she whispered. Jerry White, he has photographs of us together. He threatened to ruin your reputation, your business. He threatened Linda's job. Lucky's expression went arctic as understanding flooded through him. His father's manipulation explained everything. Ruth's sudden departure, her refusal to accept help, her desperate circumstances over the past months. He's been watching us, Ruth continued, her voice growing stronger with confession. He offered me $500,000 to disappear. When I refused, he made sure I couldn't find work anywhere. He's been systematically destroying my life to force me to take his money and vanish. Lucky felt rage build in his chest until it felt like a physical force. His father had targeted the woman he loved, had driven her to homelessness while she carried his grandchildren, had manipulated them both with threats and surveillance. He failed, Lucky said quietly, his voice carrying deadly promise. Whatever he threatened, whatever he promised, he failed. You're here now, carrying my children, and I'm never letting anyone hurt you again. Ruth studied his face, seeing past the controlled exterior to the fierce protectiveness that blazed beneath. Lucky, the photographs still exist. He can still destroy your reputation. Let him try, Lucky said with cold certainty. My reputation means nothing compared to my family. And you, Ruth Freeman, are my family. You and our children are all that matter. Ruth felt her last defenses crumble at the absolute conviction in his voice. Here was the man she'd fallen in love with. Passionate, protective, willing to sacrifice everything for the people he cherished. I love you, she whispered, the words emerging like prayers. I love you too, Lucky replied, leaning forward to capture her lips in a kiss that tasted like coming home. And I'm going to prove it by making sure Jerry White never threatens our family again. As Dr. Harrison arrived to examine Ruth and their unborn twins, Lucky made mental notes about phone calls that needed to be made and battles that needed to be fought. His father had made a critical error. He'd threatened Lucky's family, and Lucky Blackwood had spent decades learning how to destroy men who threatened what belonged to him. The war for their happiness was just beginning, but Lucky finally had everything worth fighting for back in his arms. This time, he wouldn't let anyone take it away. Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and staying by their side? Share your story in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from, and subscribe for more incredible stories like this. Dr. Harrison's examination confirmed what Lucky had feared. Ruth was severely malnourished and dehydrated, her body sacrificing its own reserves to nourish the twins. The babies appeared healthy despite their mother's ordeal, but Ruth's condition required immediate intervention. She needs complete bed rest, proper nutrition, and constant monitoring, Dr. Harrison explained to Lucky in the hallway outside the Blue Guest Suite. The stress she's endured could trigger premature labor at any moment. These twins need every day they can get in the womb. Lucky nodded grimly, his jaw set with determination. Whatever she needs, cost is no object. I want round-the-clock nursing care and any equipment necessary to monitor the babies. Mr. Blackwood, Dr. Harrison hesitated. The emotional trauma appears as severe as the physical. She's been living in survival mode for months. Recovery will require more than medical intervention. She'll have everything she needs, Lucky promised, including the security of knowing no one will ever threaten her again. While Ruth slept under medical supervision, Lucky made the phone calls that would reshape his relationship with his father forever. The first went to his attorney, Marcus Sterling, a man whose reputation for ruthless litigation had made him very expensive and very effective. Marcus, I need you to prepare legal documents stripping Jerry White of all decision-making authority in Blackwood Industries, Lucky said without preamble. Complete severance of business ties, immediate termination of board positions, and legal barriers preventing any future interference in company operations. Lucky, that's essentially declaring war on your own father, Marcus warned. The legal battles could last years and cost millions. Then we'd better win quickly, Lucky replied coldly. I also need a comprehensive investigation into his surveillance activities. If he's been photographing people without consent, he's committed multiple felonies. I want evidence that will bury him if he ever threatens my family again. The second call went to the head of his security team, asking them to sweep the mansion for surveillance devices and to implement protection protocols around Ruth that would prevent any future invasion of their privacy. The third call was to Jerry White himself. Hello, son. Jerry's voice carried smug satisfaction. I assume the cleaning girl finally came crawling back, ready to discuss reasonable arrangements for this unfortunate situation. The only arrangement we're discussing is your complete removal from my life," Lucky said with Arctic calm. "You threatened a pregnant woman, Jerry. You drove the mother of my children to homelessness. You surveillance my private property and violated federal privacy laws. Your war is with me now." Jerry's laugh held no warmth. "You think you can threaten me, boy? I built this empire before you were born. I made you everything you are." "You built a company," Lucky corrected. "I turned it into an empire. And now I'm going to use that empire to make sure you never hurt another person I care about." "Those photographs still exist, Lucky. Your reputation." "My reputation is my own to manage," Lucky interrupted. "Release whatever photographs you want. The woman I loved is upstairs carrying my children, and I'm proud of every moment we've shared. If the world has a problem with that, they can take it up with my legal team." The silence on Jerry's end stretched long enough to suggest Lucky had called his bluff more effectively than expected. "You're making a mistake, son." "I'm correcting one," Lucky replied. "Goodbye, Jerry. Enjoy explaining to your board why you're no longer welcome at Blackwood Industries." Lucky hung up and immediately placed a fourth call to the editor of the city's largest newspaper, offering an exclusive interview about his relationship with Ruth and his plans for their future together. If Jerry wanted to wage a publicity war, Lucky would control the narrative from the beginning. By morning, Lucky had effectively declared independence from his father's influence, while simultaneously building legal and financial fortifications around his growing family. Ruth woke to find her room filled with flowers and medical equipment, with Lucky asleep in the chair beside her bed. "Lucky," she whispered, not wanting to wake him, but needing to confirm he was really there. His eyes opened immediately, the deep sleep of exhaustion giving way to instant alertness. "How are you feeling? Do you need anything? Should I call Dr. Harrison?" Ruth smiled at his immediate concern, remembering why she'd fallen in love with this man who treated her comfort as his highest priority. "I feel better, rested. The babies are moving normally." Lucky's face transformed with relief as he moved to sit on the bed's edge, his hand hovering over her rounded belly with obvious longing. "May I?" he asked softly. Ruth guided his palm to where one of the twins was actively kicking. Watching Lucky's expression shift to wonder as he felt his child move for the first time. "They're strong," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "Just like their mother." "Lucky, about your father's threats." "Handled," Lucky said firmly. "Jerry White no longer has any power over our lives. I've severed all business relationships, implemented legal protections, and prepared counter-strategies for any public relations battle he wants to fight." Ruth stared at him, processing the implications of what he'd just described. "You've cut ties with your father? Lucky, that could cost you billions." "It could," Lucky agreed calmly. "And it would be worth every penny to protect our family." "Ruth, I need you to understand something. There is no amount of money, no business relationship, no social pressure that matters more than you and our children." The fierce conviction in his voice made Ruth's chest tighten with emotions she'd been afraid to feel. Here was the man she'd fallen in love with, proving that his devotion transcended every obstacle she'd imagined insurmountable. "What about your reputation, your business partnerships?" Lucky's smile was gentle but determined. "I'm about to give an exclusive interview to the Herald about our relationship, our love story, and our plans for the future. By tomorrow morning, the entire city will know that Lucky Blackwood is madly in love with Ruth Freeman and proud to be the father of her children." Ruth felt tears gather at the thought of Lucky publicly claiming their relationship, despite every social pressure that made it complicated. "People will judge you. They'll say terrible things about both of us." "Let them," Lucky said fiercely. "The people whose opinions matter will see what I see, a brilliant, compassionate woman who survived impossible circumstances and still managed to maintain her integrity. The people whose opinions don't matter can go to hell." Ruth felt her last defenses crumble completely at his passionate defense. This was why she loved him, his absolute certainty about her worth, his willingness to fight the entire world for their happiness. "I love you," she whispered, reaching up to trace the strong line of his jaw. I love you so much it terrifies me." "Then marry me," Lucky said simply, as if proposing marriage was the most natural progression in the world. Ruth's breath caught at the unexpected proposal. "Lucky, marry me," he repeated, his eyes blazing with sincerity. "Not because of the babies, not because of social expectations, but because I can't imagine spending another day without you as my wife. Because you make me better than I ever thought I could be. Because you're my second chance at everything beautiful in life." Ruth studied his face, seeing past the wealth and privilege to the man underneath. Someone who'd loved deeply, lost completely, and was somehow finding the courage to risk his heart again, with absolute conviction. "Yes," she whispered, the word emerging like a prayer. "Yes, I'll marry you." Lucky's smile was brilliant and tender as he leaned down to capture her lips in a kiss that tasted like promises and possibility. When they broke apart, both were crying with joy and relief. "We'll do this right," Lucky murmured against her forehead. "Small ceremony, just family and close friends. But first, we're getting you and the babies through the next few weeks safely." Ruth nodded, feeling for the first time in months that everything might actually work out. They had love, they had each other, and they had Lucky's unwavering determination to protect their family from anyone who threatened their happiness. 3 weeks later, Ruth went into labor during a December snowstorm that blanketed the city in pristine white. Lucky held her hand through 18 hours of difficult labor, whispering encouragement and love through every contraction. Sarah Rose Blackwood arrived first, screaming her displeasure at the cold world, with lungs that suggested she'd inherited her mother's strength. Samuel James Blackwood followed 20 minutes later, quieter but equally determined to make his presence known. "They're perfect," Lucky whispered, tears streaming down his face as he held his daughter while Ruth cradled their son. "Ruth, they're absolutely perfect." Ruth looked at the man she loved, holding their daughter with reverent care, and felt her heart expand beyond anything she'd thought possible. Here was their family, unconventional, hard-won, built on love that had survived every test life could devise. "Sarah after your first wife," Ruth observed softly, understanding the honor Lucky had bestowed on their daughter. "And Samuel after my grandfather, the only member of my family who taught me that wealth meant nothing without character." Lucky's voice grew rough with emotion. "They're going to grow up knowing they're loved, Ruth. They're going to know their worth isn't measured in dollars." The newspaper interview published while Ruth was in labor, featuring Lucky's passionate defense of their relationship and his complete rejection of his father's influence. The response was overwhelmingly positive. The business community respected Lucky's integrity, and the public found their love story compelling rather than scandalous. Jerry White's attempt to release compromising photographs backfired spectacularly when Lucky's legal team proved they'd been obtained through illegal surveillance. Jerry faced federal charges for invasion of privacy, while Lucky's reputation emerged stronger than ever. 6 months after the twins' birth, Lucky and Ruth were married in the mansion's garden, surrounded by spring flowers and the people who'd supported their unconventional love story. Mrs. Faith, who'd grown to genuinely love Ruth and the babies, served as matron of honor. Joseph Denny, who'd come to understand that love transcended logic, stood as Lucky's best man. Ruth wore Sarah's wedding dress, altered to fit her figure, with Lucky's blessing and the late woman's jewelry. It felt like receiving approval from the past while stepping confidently into the future. "Do you, Lucky James Blackwood, take Ruth Elizabeth Freeman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the minister asked. "I do," Lucky said firmly, his eyes never leaving Ruth's face. "For richer, for poorer, for better, for worse, for as long as we both shall live." "Do you, Ruth Elizabeth Freeman, take Lucky James Blackwood to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Ruth felt tears of joy gather as she looked at the man who'd seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, who'd fought for their love when she'd been too afraid to believe it was possible. "I do," she whispered, her voice carrying across the garden like a promise, forever and always. When Lucky kissed his bride, their twins sleeping peacefully in their grandmother Linda's arms, It felt like the most natural thing in the world. Love had conquered every obstacle: social pressure, family interference, fear, and the devastating power of those who sought to keep them apart. 1 year later, Ruth graduated summa cum laude from nursing school. Having returned to pursue her dreams with Lucky's complete support, she specialized in pediatric oncology, following Sarah's interrupted path while making it her own. Lucky established the Sarah Blackwood Foundation for Childhood Cancer Research, honoring his first wife's memory while building a legacy with his second. The mansion was renovated to be a home rather than a shrine, filled with children's laughter and the warmth of a family built on love that had been tested and proven unbreakable. Sarah Rose grew into a spirited toddler with her mother's intelligence and her father's determination, while Samuel James displayed quiet thoughtfulness and a gentle nature that made everyone he met feel treasured. Ruth often stood in the same garden where they'd been married, watching Lucky play with their children and marveling at the journey that had brought them together. From a woman cleaning houses at dawn to the beloved wife of a billionaire seemed impossible, but love had made it inevitable. Lucky would find her during these reflective moments, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he'd ask, though he already knew the answer. How impossible this all seemed. Ruth would reply, leaning back against his solid warmth. "How many reasons we had to give up, and how many reasons we had to fight," Lucky would add, his voice warm with satisfaction. "Love doesn't care about logic, Ruth. It cares about truth. And the truth is that we belong together." Ruth would turn in his arms then, studying the face that had become more precious to her than any treasure. Seeing in his storm-gray eyes the same wonder she felt every day at their improbable happiness. "I love you, Lucky Blackwood," she'd whisper, the words as fresh and necessary as the first time she'd spoken them. "I love you too, Ruth Blackwood," he'd reply, her married name still making them both smile with satisfaction, forever and always. Their love story became legendary in the city, cited as proof that genuine connection could transcend any social barrier. Lucky's business empire flourished under his independent leadership, while Ruth's medical career provided her with the purpose and fulfillment she'd always craved. Jerry White, facing federal charges and social exile, eventually approached Lucky seeking reconciliation. The meeting was brief and decisive. "I was protecting the family legacy," Jerry tried to explain, his arrogance finally cracked by consequences he couldn't control. "You were protecting your prejudices," Lucky replied calmly. "Ruth and our children are my family legacy now. You chose to be their enemy, so you chose to be mine." Jerry White disappeared from their lives permanently, his influence finally severed by his own cruelty and Lucky's unwavering determination to protect those he loved. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the simplest act of mercy, a billionaire choosing to save a pregnant woman sleeping in her car rather than walking away from complications he couldn't control. Sometimes love requires the courage to see past circumstances to the person underneath. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, love proves stronger than every force that seeks to tear it apart. Lucky and Ruth's story became proof that worth isn't measured in bank accounts or social positions, but in the depth of one's character and the courage to love completely, despite every reason to hold back. Their children grew up understanding that they were living proof of love's power to transcend any obstacle, and that their parents' greatest achievement wasn't wealth or status, but the family they'd built through determination, faith, and the kind of love that changes everything it touches. In the end, Lucky Blackwood's greatest fortune wasn't the billions in his bank account, but the woman who'd taught him that hearts could be broken and healed, that love could die and be reborn, and that sometimes the most precious gifts come disguised as complications we never planned to accept. Ruth Freeman Blackwood's greatest triumph wasn't escaping poverty or achieving social status, but learning that she was worthy of the kind of love that sees past circumstances to embrace the soul underneath. She'd found a man who loved her, not despite her humble beginnings, but because of the strength and character those beginnings had forged in her spirit. Together, they proved that some love stories are worth fighting for, no matter the cost, and their twins, Sarah Rose and Samuel James, grew up knowing they were living testimony to the truth that love, when real and determined and brave enough to face any challenge, really can conquer all. Sometimes mercy changes everything, sometimes love transcends logic, and sometimes, if we're very fortunate, we find the courage to claim the happiness we never dared believe we deserved. Lucky and Ruth Blackwood had found that courage, claimed that happiness, and built a life that proved love really could write the most beautiful endings to the most impossible stories. The end was actually a beginning, the first chapter of a love that would last forever, nurtured by two people who'd learned that the greatest treasures aren't things that can be bought, but hearts that choose to love completely, bravely, and without reservation. Sometimes, the greatest love stories begin with the simplest act of mercy. Have you ever made a choice that changed everything? Share your story in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from around the world, and subscribe for tomorrow's new tale of love conquering all obstacles. Tomorrow, we'll discover how a single mother's desperate prayer in a hospital chapel leads to an encounter with a mysterious surgeon who's been searching for her his entire life.